The transport shuttle bumped through another rough patch of space debris as it approached Hadley's Rest. Nora Blake pressed her face against the small window and watched the mining station grow larger against the backdrop of swirling asteroids. She had seen dozens of frontier outposts in her travels, but this one looked particularly rough around the edges. Metal patches covered hull breaches, and several docking arms hung at odd angles like broken fingers. "First time out here?" asked the pilot, a gruff human with oil stains on his coveralls. His name tag read Pete in faded letters. Nora nodded and gave him a small smile. "Looking for work?" Pete laughed and shook his head. "Lady, you picked a hell of a time to come job hunting. Word is the pirates been sniffing around this sector pretty heavy lately. Couple supply runs got hit real bad last week." "Pirates?" Nora adjusted the strap of her simple duffel bag. Everything she owned seemed to fit in that one worn canvas sack. "Are they dangerous?" "Dangerous?" Pete's eyes went wide. "Honey, we're talking about the Crimson Swarm. They don't just rob you and send you on your way. These bastards burn everything they touch." He flipped some switches on his control panel as the docking clamps engaged with a heavy thunk. "You sure you don't want me to take you back to the inner systems? I got return cargo heading to New Tokyo tomorrow." Nora shook her head again. "I'm sure. Thank you for the ride, Pete." The airlock cycled open with a hiss of equalizing pressure. The air inside Hadley's Rest smelled like recycled oxygen mixed with industrial lubricants and something that might have been alien cooking. Nora stepped through the entrance and found herself in a bustling arrival bay, filled with creatures she had only seen in textbooks. A group of Kretak workers scuttled past, their insect-like bodies clicking and chittering as they moved cargo, containers with their 4 arms. Their compound eyes reflected the harsh fluorescent lighting like black mirrors. Near the customs desk, 2 Molari technicians worked on a broken atmospheric processor. Their amphibious skin glistened with moisture, and their large mouths moved in the burbling language of their water world. But it was the Vorth security guards that made everyone give them a wide berth. The reptilian aliens stood nearly 7 feet tall, their scales the color of old bronze and their yellow eyes constantly scanning for threats. Each one carried a plasma rifle that looked like it could punch holes through starship hulls. Nora walked up to the customs desk where a tired-looking Molari official sat behind a screen full of scrolling data. His nameplate identified him as Gulch, Station Administrator. "Purpose of visit?" Gulch asked without looking up from his screen. His translator gave his burbling words a mechanical edge. "Looking for work," Nora said simply. "Skills? General labor, maintenance, whatever you need." Gulch finally looked up at her with his large, dark eyes. He seemed to take in her plain appearance, her simple clothes, and her complete lack of any visible equipment or weapons. "You sure about that, human? This isn't exactly a safe neighborhood anymore. I can take care of myself." "Uh-huh." Gulch tapped something on his screen. "You got any combat training, security experience? Hell, you even know how to fire a blaster?" Nora shook her head. "I don't carry weapons." Gulch's mouth fell open, showing rows of small, pointed teeth. Several other beings in the customs area turned to stare at the strange human, who had just admitted to being completely defenseless in one of the most dangerous sectors of known space. "Lady," Gulch said slowly, "maybe you should reconsider. The Outer Rim ain't no place for pacifists." "I'll be fine," Nora insisted with that same small smile. Gulch shrugged and stamped her entry permit. "Your funeral. Civilian quarters are on level 3. Try not to get yourself killed before you find work." Nora took her permit and headed for the lift. As the doors closed behind her, she could hear Gulch muttering to his assistant about crazy humans and death wishes. Level 3 turned out to be a maze of narrow corridors lined with doors that had seen better decades. The civilian quarters were basically closets with bunks, but Nora had stayed in worse places. She dropped her duffel bag on the thin mattress and sat down to survey her new temporary home. The walls were thin enough that she could hear her neighbors clearly. On one side, a family of Kretak were having what sounded like an argument about shift schedules. Their clicking speech rose and fell in agitated patterns. On the other side, someone was playing music that sounded like whale songs mixed with drum beats. Nora pulled out a small tablet from her bag and began scrolling through station information. Personnel files, security protocols, structural layouts. She absorbed it all with the quiet focus of someone who knew exactly what she was looking for. Hours passed. The station's artificial day cycle dimmed the corridor lighting to simulate evening. Nora had memorized every critical system on Hadley's Rest, from the fusion reactors to the waste reclamation plants. She knew which sections had the best defensive positions and which corridors would become death traps in a firefight. Her quiet study was interrupted by shouting from the main corridor. She stepped outside her room to see a crowd gathering around the central communication hub. Aliens of all species stood clustered around the large public screen, their voices creating a babble of different languages, all expressing the same emotion: fear. Nora pushed through the crowd until she could see the screen clearly. It showed a long-range sensor display with dozens of red contacts moving through hyperspace toward their system. The sensor operator, a nervous-looking human woman, was trying to explain what they were seeing. The signatures match known pirate vessels, she was saying. Mixed fleet composition but heavily armed. Estimated arrival time is 36 hours. A massive fourth security chief named Grex pushed his way to the front of the crowd. His scales were darker than most of his kind, almost black, and scars crisscrossed his snout and forehead. "How many ships?" he demanded. "At least 60 confirmed contacts," the operator replied. "Could be more hiding in the sensor shadows." The crowd erupted in panic. Aliens began pushing toward the exits, some shouting about evacuation while others argued about making a stand. In the chaos, Nora noticed that the experienced security personnel weren't panicking. Instead, they were quietly forming small groups and speaking in low voices. She watched Grex gather his Vorth warriors near the weapon lockers. The reptilian soldiers checked their plasma rifles and tested their armor systems with the calm professionalism of veterans. Near the communications console, a squad of Kretok fighters chittered among themselves, their mandibles clicking in what she recognized as tactical planning. But it was the group of Malari technicians that caught her attention. Instead of preparing weapons, they were accessing the station's defensive systems and running diagnostics on the shields and automated turrets. Their leader, an older female with silver markings on her neck, noticed Nora watching. "You should find a place to hide. Human," the Malari said gently. "When the pirates come, they won't distinguish between combatants and civilians." "What about you?" Nora asked. "We'll do what we can to keep the station's defenses online, but with 60 ships." The alien's large eyes looked sad. "We're miners, and technicians, not soldiers." Nora looked around at all the different species preparing for a battle they couldn't win. Families were hugging goodbye. Warriors were checking weapons they all knew wouldn't be enough. Technicians were running diagnostics on systems that would be overwhelmed in the first few minutes of combat. "Excuse me," she said quietly to no one in particular, and walked back toward her quarters. Behind her, the arguments continued about evacuation versus resistance, about contacting the authorities versus negotiating with pirates. But Nora wasn't thinking about any of those options. Instead, she was calculating response times, fleet compositions, and the exact message she would need to send. In her room, she opened her duffel bag and pulled out what looked like a standard civilian communication device. But when she activated it, the device's true nature became clear. Military-grade encryption, quantum entanglement protocols, and access codes that could reach the most classified networks in human space. Nora composed a brief message. "Hadley's Rest. Crimson Swarm inbound. 60-plus vessels. Civilian population at risk. Request immediate assistance." She paused before adding the final line. "Weapon deployment authorized." Then she sent the message and sat back on her bunk to wait. Outside her thin walls, the station buzzed with desperate activity, as beings prepared for a battle they couldn't win. But Nora wasn't worried about the approaching pirate fleet. She was worried about what would happen when they discovered what they had really found at this remote mining station. Panic spread through Hadley's Rest like wildfire as the reality of their situation sank in. The approaching fleet had been identified as the Crimson Swarm, led by a Vorth warlord named Cass, who was known throughout the Outer Rim for his brutality. Unlike other pirate groups who were content with cargo and credits, the swarm left nothing but wreckage and bodies in their wake. Emergency meetings were called in every section of the station. The 3 patrol boats that served as Hadley's Rest, primary defense force, were hopelessly outgunned. Their captains, a mix of human and alien veterans, sat around the security briefing table looking grim as they studied the tactical display. "We might be able to take out 5 or 6 of their lighter vessels," said Commander Torres, the human who led the small defense fleet. "But against 60 ships, including heavy cruisers, we'll be space dust in 10 minutes. The station's various species had begun forming their own defensive groups, old prejudices surfacing under the pressure. The Kretak warriors gathered in the industrial sections, using their natural ability to work in zero gravity to set up defensive positions in the maintenance shafts. Their compound eyes gave them excellent peripheral vision, and their 4 arms let them handle multiple weapons at once. The Malari security forces took control of the technical areas, their knowledge of the station's systems making them invaluable for coordinating any defensive effort. Their webbed hands flew over control panels as they rerouted power to defensive systems and tried to coax more performance out of aging shield generators. The Vorth security team, led by the scarred Chief Grex, claimed the main armory and began distributing weapons to anyone who could hold them. Their reptilian heritage gave them tough scales that could stop small arms fire, and their natural aggression made them formidable close-quarters fighters. In the midst of all this frantic preparation, Nora Blake sat quietly in the main hub, still reading her tablet. She had changed into clean clothes but otherwise looked exactly the same as when she had arrived, unremarkable, unarmed, and completely calm. This did not go unnoticed. "Look at her," muttered a Kretak dock worker named Zix to his companions. "The human sits there reading while we prepare to die." Zix was larger than most of his species, with darker chitin and more prominent mandibles that marked him as a warrior caste. He had served in his people's military before coming to the mining station, and he wore his combat experience like armor. "Maybe she's too scared to move," suggested another Kretak. But Zix shook his head. "No. Look at her breathing, her posture. She's not afraid. She's just, waiting." The group of alien workers approached Nora's table. She looked up from her tablet with that same small smile she had worn since arriving on the station. "You need to arm yourself, human," Zix said bluntly. His translator gave his chittering words a harsh mechanical edge. "The pirates will be here in less than 30 hours. "I know," Nora replied calmly. "I heard the announcement." "Then why aren't you preparing? Why aren't you afraid?" Nora tilted her head as if considering the question carefully. "Should I be afraid?" The question caught Zix off guard. In his experience, humans were either terrified of danger or too stupid to recognize it. This human seemed to be neither. "The Crimson Swarm has destroyed 17 stations in the past year," he said. "They take no prisoners, they leave no survivors. Yes, you should be afraid." Nora nodded as if he had told her something mildly interesting rather than terrifying. "Have you fought them before?" "I fought pirates during the border wars," Zix said proudly. "I know how they think, how they operate." "Then you'll be valuable in the defense," Nora said. "Good luck." She turned back to her tablet as if the conversation was over. Zix stared at her for a moment, his compound eyes reflecting confusion and growing irritation. "Human," he said more loudly, causing other beings in the hub to turn their attention to the conversation. "You didn't answer my question. Why aren't you preparing to fight?" Nora looked up again, and this time her smile seemed different somehow. Not unfriendly, but carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. "I don't fight," she said simply. This statement caused a stir among the gathered aliens. Several more security personnel moved closer to listen, including Chief Grex, who towered over the group like a bronze statue. "Everyone fights when death comes," Grex rumbled, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "It is the way of all living things." "Not me," Nora said. "I don't carry weapons either." The admission sent a ripple of disbelief through the crowd. Even the civilian species carried basic protection in the outer rim, stun batons, small plasma pistols, or at least personal shields. To be completely unarmed was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. Then how do you expect to survive when the swarm arrives? Asked a Malari technician named Bloob. His large eyes blinked slowly as he tried to understand the human's logic. Nora's smile widened slightly, and for just a moment, something predatory flickered in her brown eyes. It was gone so quickly that most of the observers missed it, but Chief Grex noticed. His own predator instincts, honed by millions of years of Vorth evolution, recognized something familiar in that brief expression. "I don't carry weapons," Nora repeated quietly, "because I am the weapon." The statement hung in the air like a challenge. Several aliens laughed outright at what seemed like typical human boasting. Humans were known throughout the galaxy for their tendency to make grand claims about their abilities. They talked about their endurance, their adaptability, their stubborn refusal to give up. But when faced with superior technology and larger, stronger opponents, they usually died just as easily as anyone else. "You?" Zix's mandibles clicked, in what passed for laughter among his kind. "You're going to fight 60 ships of battle-hardened pirates with your bare hands?" "If I have to," Nora said calmly. More laughter erupted from the crowd. A young Kretak named Tick made exaggerated fighting motions with all 4 of his arms, causing his companions to chittering with amusement. Even some of the Malari technicians were burbling what sounded like alien chuckles. But not everyone was laughing. Chief Grex continued to stare at the small human woman with growing interest. Something about her absolute confidence didn't fit with the image of a defenseless civilian. In his years of military service, he had learned to recognize dangerous beings by more than just their size or weapons. Sometimes the most lethal opponents were the ones who didn't need to prove anything to anyone. "Human," he said slowly, his yellow eyes fixed on Nora's face. "What is your name?" "Nora Blake." "Nora Blake," he repeated, testing the sounds. "That name, it sounds familiar." "It's a common human name," Nora replied. But Grex caught something in her tone, not defensiveness exactly, but a subtle shift that suggested he was getting close to something she'd rather not discuss. "Perhaps," he said, "but I think we should prepare as if you won't be fighting 60 ships with your bare hands. The rest of us will need more conventional weapons." The crowd began to disperse as beings returned to their preparations, but many continued to glance back at Nora as they walked away. The strange human had become the subject of considerable speculation throughout the station. In the Kretak worker areas, Zix told his companions about the conversation. "She's either completely insane or hiding something. No one is that calm facing the swarm unless they know something we don't." In the Malari technical sections, Bloob shared similar concerns with his fellow engineers. Her physiological readings were unusual. Heart rate steady, no stress indicators, pupils normal. Either she's in deep psychological shock, or she genuinely isn't worried. In the Vorth security office, Chief Grex sat at his desk and accessed the station's communication logs. Something about Nora Blake bothered him, and in his experience, those kinds of feelings were worth investigating. What he found made his scales ripple with surprise. The human had sent a single message shortly after arriving on the station. It was heavily encrypted and transmitted on quantum channels normally reserved for military use. His security clearance wasn't high enough to break the encryption, but the transmission log showed it had been sent to an address in the core systems. Grex leaned back in his chair and thought about the implications. A civilian with military communication access, complete confidence in the face of overwhelming danger, and a name that nagged at his memory like a half-remembered dream. He activated his personal terminal and began searching through military databases, looking for any reference to Nora Blake in connection with human military operations. Most of the files were classified above his clearance level, but he found fragments. Mission reports with names blacked out, casualty lists with gaps where names should have been, commendation records for operations that officially never happened. The picture that emerged made Chief Grex very uncomfortable. If his suspicions were correct, then Hadley's Rest hadn't just received a random civilian looking for work. They had received something much more dangerous. As the station's artificial night cycle began, Nora returned to her quarters and sat on her narrow bunk. Through the thin walls she could hear the sounds of preparation, weapons being cleaned, defensive positions being tested, families saying what might be their final goodbyes. She pulled out her tablet and reviewed the station's defensive capabilities one more time. 3 patrol boats, 42 security personnel of various species, and maybe 100 civilians who could hold weapons if necessary. Against the Crimson swarmed 60 ships and 3,000 battle-hardened pirates. It should have been no contest. Should have been. Nora smiled to herself and settled back against her pillow. Tomorrow would bring the swarm, and with them the answers to all the questions the station's inhabitants had been asking about her. She was looking forward to it. Red alert klaxons wailed throughout Hadley's Rest as the Crimson Swarm dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the system. Long-range sensors showed the full scope of their nightmare. Not 60 ships as originally estimated, but 73 vessels of various sizes, all armed and moving in perfect formation toward the mining station. At the center of the fleet was a massive dreadnought that dwarfed everything else in the formation. Its hull was painted the deep crimson that gave the pirate fleet its name, and weapon ports lined its surface like the eyes of some ancient predator. This was the flagship of Warlord Cass, the Vorth commander who had turned piracy into an art form of destruction. In the station's command center, Commander Torres watched the tactical display with growing despair. The 3 patrol boats under his command looked like insects next to the approaching swarm. Even if every weapon on the station fired simultaneously, they might be able to disable a handful of the smaller escort vessels. Incoming transmission, reported the communications officer, her voice tight with fear. Put it through, Torres said. The main screen flickered and resolved into the image of Warlord Cass himself. The Vorth pirate leader was massive even by his species standards, standing nearly 8 feet tall with scales the color of dried blood. Scars covered his snout and neck, evidence of countless battles, and his yellow eyes held the cold intelligence of a predator who had never known defeat. Greetings, inhabitants of Hadley's Rest, Cass said, his voice carrying easily over the translator's mechanical reproduction. I am Warlord Cass of the Crimson Swarm, and I have come to collect what is mine. He paused, letting the implications sink in before continuing. Your station contains valuable resources, refined metals, rare minerals, and most importantly, a large population of healthy workers. I will give you one opportunity to surrender these assets peacefully. Transfer all your refined materials to my cargo vessels, and prepare your population for relocation to my labor facilities. Commander Torres felt his stomach turn at the casual mention of slavery, but he forced himself to keep listening. If you comply within 6 hours, I will allow your leaders to remain on the station to maintain basic operations. If you resist, Cass's scarred features twisted into what might have been a smile. Well, I think you know my reputation. The choice is yours. The transmission ended, leaving the command center in stunned silence. 6 hours to surrender everything they had worked to build, or face complete annihilation. It wasn't really a choice at all. What do we do? Asked the communications officer. Torres looked around the room at the mixed group of human and alien personnel. They were miners, technicians, and small-time security officers, not soldiers. They had signed up to extract resources from asteroids, not fight one of the most feared pirate fleets in known space. We evacuate what civilians we can, he said finally. The cargo haulers can take maybe 300 people if we strip out all unnecessary equipment. The rest of us, he shrugged, the rest of us buy them time to get away. Throughout the station, word of Cass's ultimatum spread like wildfire. Families gathered in cargo bays, clutching whatever possessions they could carry. The lucky ones, who might make it onto evacuation ships, said tearful goodbyes to friends and loved ones who would stay behind. In the security sections, the various species continued their preparations. The Kretak warriors had turned the maintenance tunnels into a maze of defensive positions, their natural ability to cling to any surface making them deadly in the confined spaces. The Malari technicians worked frantically to boost power to the station's aging defensive systems. The Vorth security forces distributed the last of the heavy weapons to anyone who could use them. But in the civilian quarters, Nora Blake was doing something unexpected. Instead of packing her few belongings or trying to secure a place on an evacuation ship, she was making modifications to her simple clothing. Using tools that seemed to appear from nowhere in her duffel bag, she attached small devices to her sleeves and collar. To a casual observer, they looked like communication equipment or maybe personal shields. They weren't. Chief Grex found her there as she finished her preparations. The large Vorth had spent the night researching human military records, and what he'd discovered had left him with more questions than answers. "Nora Blake," he said carefully, watching her reaction to his presence. "Chief Grex?" She looked up at him with that same calm smile. "Shouldn't you be preparing your security teams?" "They are prepared, as much as they can be against those odds." He gestured toward her modified clothing. "What about you? Are you prepared?" "Almost." She stood and tested the range of motion in her arms and legs. The modifications didn't seem to interfere with her movement at all. "Just a few more adjustments. I've been researching human military records," Grex said bluntly. "There are references to someone named Blake in connection with several classified operations that officially never happened." Nora's hands stilled for a moment, but her expression didn't change. "That's interesting. What kind of operations?" "The kind where entire pirate fleets disappear without a trace. The kind where terrorist cells are found dead in locked rooms with no sign of how their killer got in or out. The kind where the only evidence left behind is a signature that military intelligence calls the weapon." For the first time since arriving on the station, Nora's smile faded completely. When she looked at Grex, her brown eyes held depths that hadn't been there before. Depths that spoke of years of training, countless missions, and experiences that would break most minds. "Chief Grex," she said quietly, "I need you to do something for me." "What?" "When the boarding begins, I need you to keep your people away from the central corridors. No matter what you hear, no matter what shows up on the security feeds, keep them in defensive positions and don't come looking for me." "Why?" Nora picked up her tablet and tapped in an access code. The screen displayed a series of authorization codes that made Grex's scales ripple with shock. The clearance levels were higher than anything he'd ever seen, including military intelligence operations during the border wars. "Because," Nora said simply, "I'm about to do my job." Before Grex could respond, the station shuddered under the impact of something massive hitting the outer hull. Emergency lights flashed as the artificial gravity fluctuated, and the sound of tearing metal echoed through the corridors. "First boarding pods," Grex muttered, checking his tactical display. "They're hitting us in 6 different locations simultaneously." On his screen, they could see the crude assault pods the Crimson Swarm used for boarding operations. Each pod contained 25 heavily armed pirates, and they were launching them faster than the station's point defense systems could intercept. Within minutes, hundreds of enemy soldiers would be pouring into Hadley's Rest. "I need to get to my security teams," Grex said, but Nora caught his arm. "Nora, remember what I said. Keep them in defensive positions. Don't come looking for me." She met his yellow eyes with her brown ones. "And Chief, when this is over, there's going to be a lot of questions about what happened here. The official report should say that the Crimson Swarm suffered catastrophic system failures during their assault. Equipment malfunctions. Nothing more." Grex stared at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. In his years of military service, he had learned when not to ask questions. "Good luck, Nora Blake," he said. "I don't need luck," she replied, and for the first time since meeting her, Grex believed it completely. More impacts shook the station as additional boarding pods found their targets. Through the security network, they could hear the first sounds of combat as Vorth shock troops began cutting their way out of the pods and into the station's corridors. These weren't ordinary pirates. The Crimson Swarm recruited from military, deserters, mercenary companies, and the warrior castes of a dozen different species. They wore powered armor, carried military-grade weapons, and fought with the discipline of professional soldiers. Against them, Hadley's Rest had miners with jury-rigged weapons and security guards who normally dealt with drunk dock workers. It should have been a massacre. Nora walked calmly toward the central corridor where the first boarding pod had breached. Behind her, Grex activated his communicator and began giving orders to his scattered security teams. All units, fall back to secondary defensive positions. Repeat, do not engage in the central corridors. Let them come to us. His subordinates acknowledged the orders with confusion in their voices. The central corridors were the natural choke points where they should have made their stand. Falling back to secondary positions meant giving the pirates free access to most of the station. But Grex had seen something in Nora Blake's eyes that reminded him of the most dangerous predators on his homeworld. The ones who didn't hunt in packs because they didn't need to. In the central corridor, sparks flew as plasma cutters sliced through the boarding pod's hull. The metal began to glow and buckle as the pirates prepared to emerge into the station. Standard procedure would be to emerge in overwhelming force, secure the immediate area, then advance in coordinated teams towards strategic objectives. They had done this dozens of times before on stations just like this one. It was a proven tactic against frightened civilians and lightly armed security forces. But as the hull finally gave way, and the first Vorth shock trooper stepped through the breach, he found something unexpected waiting for him in the corridor. A small human woman, in simple black clothing, standing alone and unarmed, wearing that same calm smile she'd worn since arriving on the station. The shock trooper raised his plasma rifle and opened his mouth to demand her surrender. He never got the chance to speak. What happened next would be talked about in frightened whispers throughout the Outer Rim for years to come. But in the security office, Chief Grex simply watched his tactical display as red contacts representing enemy forces began disappearing from his screens one by one, and he smiled. The first Vorth shock trooper to emerge from the boarding pod was a veteran named Drex, who had survived 37 successful raids with the Crimson Swarm. He wore powered armor that could stop small arms fire and carried a plasma rifle capable of melting through starship hulls. Behind him, 24 more elite warriors prepared to flood into the station and begin the systematic slaughter that was their trademark. Drex expected to find terrified civilians or maybe a few security guards cowering behind improvised barricades. Instead, he found a single human woman standing in the middle of the corridor, hands at her sides, looking as relaxed as if she were waiting for a shuttle. "Surrender and you will die quickly," Drex growled through his helmet's translator, raising his plasma rifle. It was the only mercy the Crimson Swarm ever offered. Nora tilted her head slightly, studying the armored figure with curious brown eyes. "That's very kind of you," she said politely, "but I'm afraid I can't accept." Drex's finger tightened on the trigger, but something made him pause. There was something wrong with the human's voice. Too calm, too controlled. In his experience, beings facing death showed fear in dozens of different ways. They trembled, they pleaded, they tried to run, or they attacked in desperate fury. This human did none of those things. She simply stood there and smiled. "Move aside, human," called another voice from inside the boarding pod. "Let us through and we will make your death painless." "I'm sorry," Nora said, and for the first time, her smile took on a predatory edge, "but I'm going to have to decline that offer as well." What happened next took less than 3 seconds, but to Drex it seemed to unfold in slow motion. The human moved like liquid lightning, her body flowing around his plasma rifle's barrel as she stepped inside his guard. Her hand touched a point on his armor's chest plate, and something small and bright flashed. Drex's powered armor, rated to withstand direct hits from military-grade weapons, simply shut down. All of it. The servos, the life support, the targeting systems, even the basic power distribution network. 200 pounds of dead weight settled onto his shoulders like a metal tomb. Before he could process what had happened, Nora's other hand found a gap in his helmet's neck seal. She pressed something against his skin, and electricity coursed through his nervous system. Not enough to kill, but enough to send him crashing to the deck in helpless convulsions. The human stepped over his twitching form and smiled at the shocked faces staring out from the boarding pod's entrance. "Next?" she asked pleasantly. The second trooper, a Malari mercenary named Glub, fired his plasma rifle without hesitation. The brilliant energy beam should have turned the human into superheated vapor. Instead, It struck some kind of personal shield that flared to life around her body, dispersing the deadly energy harmlessly. Nora looked down at the scorch mark on the deck beside her feet, then back up at Glub with an expression of mild disappointment. "That was rude," she said. Then she moved again, and Glub discovered that powered armor meant nothing when your opponent could predict exactly where you were going to be. Nora flowed between the plasma bolts like she was dancing, each step calculated, to put her exactly where the deadly beams weren't. She reached Glub's position in 4 impossible steps, her hand finding another small device attached to her sleeve. This one projected a focused electromagnetic pulse that fried every circuit in his armor's targeting computer. Blind and confused, the Malari never saw the nerve strike that dropped him beside his 4th companion. The remaining pirates in the boarding pod started to retreat, but Nora was already among them. She moved through the cramped space like a force of nature, every gesture precise and economical. Weapons jammed at critical moments, armor systems failed in cascade patterns, and nervous systems shut down under precisely applied pressure. In less than 2 minutes, 25 elite shock troopers lay unconscious or paralyzed on the deck. Not one of them was dead. Nora had been very careful about that, but they were completely helpless. She stepped back into the corridor and activated her communicator. The one Chief Grex had noticed was far too advanced for a civilian device. "Blake, to all station personnel," she said calmly. "This is Agent Nora Blake, Terran Defense Corps Special Operations Division. I am now assuming operational command of station defenses. All security personnel are ordered to maintain defensive positions and allow boarding parties to advance into the central corridors." The communication channels erupted with confused voices as beings throughout the station tried to process what they had just heard. Chief Grex's voice cut through the chatter with military precision. "All Vorth security teams," you heard the agent. "Maintain positions and let them come to us. Do not interfere with ongoing operations in the central corridors." On his tactical display, Grex watched as more boarding pods made contact with the station's hull. Dozens of red contacts appeared on his screen as pirates poured into multiple sections simultaneously, but instead of feeling despair, he found himself feeling sorry for the invaders. They had no idea what they had just walked into. In Corridor C7, a squad of Kretak pirates emerged from their pod expecting to find the soft resistance typical of mining stations. Instead, they found their weapons mysteriously malfunctioning one by one as a human shadow moved among them. Their natural speed and multiple arms meant nothing against an opponent who seemed to know exactly where they would strike before they did. In Section B12, a group of mixed-species mercenaries discovered that their powered armor was more liability than protection when the human woman appeared behind them like a ghost. Their heavy weapons became clubs when targeting systems failed, and their thick armor became prisons when mobility systems shut down. Throughout the station, the same pattern repeated. Boarding parties would breach the hull, advance confidently into what should have been defenseless corridors, and then simply disappear from the tactical displays. No explosions, no prolonged firefights, just silence where there should have been the sounds of battle. In the Crimson Swarm's flagship, Warlord Cass watched his tactical display with growing confusion and rage. His boarding parties were reporting equipment failures on an impossible scale. Weapons that had functioned perfectly for years were jamming, armor systems were shutting down for no apparent reason, and his most experienced soldiers were falling unconscious from what appeared to be nerve toxins that no scanner could detect. "What is happening down there?" he roared at his communications officer. "Unknown, sir. The boarding teams report contact with a single human female, but their descriptions don't make sense. They claim she's defeating entire squads with her bare hands." Cass's yellow eyes narrowed to slits. He had heard rumors of human special operations units, elite soldiers trained in combat techniques that bordered on the impossible, but those were just stories told by frightened civilians and defeated enemies. No single being could stand against the might of the Crimson Swarm. "Send the hunter team," he ordered. "If there's some kind of human super soldier down there, they'll know how to deal with her." The hunter team was Cass's personal kill squad, 6 beings chosen from the deadliest species in known space. They carried weapons designed specifically for eliminating high-value targets, and their leader was a Vorth assassin named Tech, who had never failed to kill his target. The hunter team's boarding pod launched from the flagship like a spear of death, its armored hull cutting through space toward the mining station. Inside, 6 killers checked their specialized weapons and prepared to show this human what real professionals could do. But on Hadley's Rest, Nora Blake stood in the central hub surrounded by the unconscious forms of 43 pirates, checking the small devices attached to her clothing. Some were spent, their charges exhausted, but she had plenty more. She looked up at the security camera she knew was watching her and smiled directly at Chief Grex. "Send the next group," she said quietly. "I'm just getting warmed up." The hunter team's pod slammed into the station's hull with the force of a meteor, cutting through the metal like paper. Steam hissed from the breach as the pod's occupants prepared to emerge into what they expected would be a standard elimination scenario. Tech, the Vorth assassin, was the first through the breach. He wore no armor, trusting instead to his natural speed, and the twin energy blades mounted on his forearms. Behind him came a Malari sniper with a rifle that could punch holes through tank armor, a Kretok demolitions expert carrying enough explosives to level a city block, and 3 other specialists trained in the art of making difficult problems disappear permanently. They found Nora waiting for them in the main corridor, sitting cross-legged on the deck with her eyes closed as if meditating. Around her, the bodies of their fallen comrades lay in neat rows. "You must be the cleanup crew," she said without opening her eyes. "I was wondering when you'd arrive." Tech activated his energy blades, their blue glow casting harsh shadows on the corridor walls. "Human, you have caused considerable inconvenience to my employer. Surrender now and I will make your death artistic." Nora opened her eyes and looked at the 6 killers surrounding her. For the first time since the boarding began, her smile held genuine warmth. "You know," she said, rising smoothly to her feet, "I was starting to think this job would be boring. Thank you for proving me wrong." Then she moved, and the hunter team discovered that there was a significant difference between killing civilians and fighting someone who had been designed from birth to be the perfect weapon. The battle lasted exactly 47 seconds, and, when it was over, 6 of the galaxy's most feared assassins lay unconscious beside their less skilled companions. Nora dusted off her hands and activated her communicator again. "Blake to Crimson Swarm flagship," she said calmly. "This is Agent Nora Blake of the Terran Defense Corps. Your boarding operation has failed. I'm prepared to discuss terms for your surrender." The response came immediately, and it was exactly what she had been expecting. "This is Warlord Cass. No human tells me when I have failed. I'm coming down there personally to finish what my incompetent soldiers could not." Nora's smile widened. "I was hoping you'd say that. I'll be waiting in the central hub. Try not to bring too many friends. I'm running out of places to put unconscious pirates." She closed the channel and began walking toward the hub, humming, a tune that sounded suspiciously cheerful for someone about to face one of the most feared warriors in the galaxy. Behind her, Chief Grex watched the security feeds and shook his head in amazement. He had served with some of the finest soldiers in the galaxy during his military career, but he had never seen anything like Nora Blake in action. She wasn't just a weapon, he realized. She was a force of nature that happened to look like a small human woman, and Warlord Cass was about to discover that there were some things in the universe that even the mighty Crimson Swarm couldn't conquer. The real battle was about to begin. Warlord Cass stormed through the corridors of Hadley's Rest like an avalanche of rage and muscle. He stood 8 feet tall in his custom battle armor, each piece crafted from the hulls of ships he had personally destroyed. His plasma cannon could punch through starship bulkheads, and his armor's power systems could keep him fighting for days without rest. Behind him marched his personal guard, 12 elite Vorth warriors who had never known defeat. They moved in perfect formation, their weapons trained on every shadow, their sensors scanning for the human who had somehow managed to humiliate the most feared pirate fleet in the galaxy. The corridors were littered with the unconscious bodies of Crimson Swarm soldiers. Hundreds of pirates lay in neat rows, their weapons beside them, their armor powered down. Not one showed signs of serious injury. It was as if they had simply decided to take a nap in the middle of their invasion. "This is impossible," muttered Grex, one of Cass's lieutenants. "No single being could defeat this many trained warriors." "Humans," spat another warrior. "They have some kind of technological advantage, stealth fields, neural disruptors, something that gives them an unfair edge." Cass said nothing, but his yellow eyes burned with fury. He had built his reputation on the absolute certainty that nothing in the galaxy could stand against the Crimson Swarm. Pirates, military forces, even planetary defense fleets had crumbled before his might. The idea that one small human could challenge that certainty was intolerable. They reached the central hub to find Nora Blake sitting calmly at a table, reading her tablet as if nothing unusual was happening. She looked up as they entered, and her brown eyes took in the massive warlord and his escort with mild interest. "Warlord Cass, I presume," she said politely. "Thank you for accepting my invitation." Cass raised his plasma cannon and aimed it directly at her chest. The weapon hummed with barely contained energy, enough to vaporize a human body in milliseconds. "You will tell me how you defeated my soldiers," he growled. "Then you will die, slowly, for the insult you have given me." Nora closed her tablet and set it carefully on the table. "I'm afraid I can't do that, Warlord. You see, what happened to your soldiers wasn't an insult. It was a demonstration." "Demonstration of what?" "Of why humans don't need to carry weapons." She stood slowly, her movements fluid and controlled. "You came here expecting to find helpless miners and frightened civilians. Instead, you found something else entirely." Cass's finger tightened on the trigger. "I found one lucky human with some kind of technological trick. Surrender your devices and I might make your death quick." Nora laughed, and the sound carried no fear at all. "Devices? Warlord, you still don't understand, do you? Let me explain something about human military doctrine." She began walking slowly around the table, her hands clearly visible and empty. Cass tracked her movement with his weapon, but something in her confident manner made him hesitate to fire. "Other species build weapons," Nora continued conversationally. "They forge better armor, design more powerful guns, construct larger ships. They believe that victory comes from having the superior tool for the job." "It does," Cass snarled. "I have conquered 17 systems with superior weapons." "Humans learned something different," Nora said, and her voice took on the tone of a teacher explaining a simple concept to a slow student. "We learned that the most dangerous weapon isn't something you carry. It's something you become." She stopped walking and faced the massive warlord directly. "Every human child learns basic combat techniques before they learn to read. Every human teenager trains in weapon systems, tactics, and survival skills as part of their education. Every human adult serves at least 2 years in military or emergency services." Cass's companions exchanged uncertain glances. This wasn't matching their intelligence about human society. "But more than that," Nora continued, "we learned to modify ourselves. Enhanced reflexes, improved muscle memory, accelerated healing, expanded sensory input. We don't build better weapons, Warlord. We build better warriors." "Genetic manipulation," breathed Grex. "That's impossible. The Galactic treaties forbid." "The Galactic treaties forbid modifying beings against their will," Nora corrected. "They say nothing about volunteers who choose to become something more than they were born to be." She reached up and touched one of the small devices on her collar. It wasn't a weapon or a shield generator as the pirates had assumed. It was a medical monitor designed to track the performance of systems that didn't exist in baseline humans. "I volunteered for the enhancement program when I was 18, she said quietly. "Genetic optimization, neural pathway acceleration, muscle density improvement, reaction time enhancement. It took 3 years to complete the modifications, and another 5 years to learn how to use them properly." Cass raised his plasma cannon higher, but his hands were trembling slightly. "You're lying. Humans are weak, soft creatures. Everyone knows this." "Everyone knows what we want them to know," Nora replied. "Do you think we advertise our military capabilities to potential enemies? Do you think we tell pirates and raiders exactly what they'll be facing if they attack human space?" She gestured toward the unconscious forms scattered throughout the hub. Your soldiers expected to fight miners and dock workers instead. They encountered a product of the most advanced military enhancement program in known space. One soldier, Cass insisted. You are still only one being against my entire fleet. Nora's smile returned, and this time it was sharp as a blade. Warlord, you really should have done more research before attacking this system. She activated her communicator with a gesture that was too fast for unenhanced eyes to follow. Blake, to Terra Command. Packages confirmed, requesting immediate support. The response came instantly, transmitted on quantum channels that cut through space faster than light itself. Support inbound. ETA 4 minutes. Cass's armor sensors detected the hyperspace distortions first, massive signatures dropping out, of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the system. His tactical display lit up with new contacts, and the numbers made his blood freeze in his veins. 12 ships materialized in space around his fleet. Not the crude patrol boats he had expected, but sleek predators that moved with deadly grace. Each vessel was smaller than his flagship, but radiated energy signatures that spoke of technology, far beyond anything the Crimson Swarm possessed. Terran Defense Corps Fleet Delta, came a calm voice over the communication channels. Warlord Cass, you are surrounded. Power down your weapons and prepare to be boarded, or we will disable your vessels by force. On the tactical display, Cass watched in horror as his mighty fleet found themselves hopelessly outgunned. The human ships moved like schools of fish, coordinating their movements with precision that spoke of enhanced crews working in perfect harmony. Impossible, he whispered. The humans have no military presence in this sector. We have military presence wherever we need it, Nora said calmly. Did you really think we'd leave our citizens unprotected? Every human settlement, every mining station, every research outpost has protection. You just never see it until you pose a threat. She took a step closer to the massive warlord, and for the first time in his career, Cass found himself backing away from an opponent. The truth is, Warlord, that every human you've ever met could have been like me. The merchant who sold you supplies, the diplomat who negotiated your prisoner exchanges, the engineer who repaired your ships. Any of them could have been enhanced. Soldiers, gathering intelligence and waiting for orders. Cass's weapon hand was shaking now. You're bluffing. No species could hide that kind of capability. We've been doing it for 200 years, Nora replied. Ever since we realized that the galaxy was full of predators who saw us as easy prey, we decided to become something else entirely. The communication channels crackled with updates from the fleet engagement. Cass's ships were surrendering one by one as the human vessels demonstrated their overwhelming technological superiority. Weapons that could barely scratch human shields, tactics that were countered before they could be implemented, command structures that crumbled under precise electronic warfare attacks. Your fleet is finished, Warlord, Nora said gently. Your soldiers are unconscious but alive. You can surrender now and face trial for your crimes, or you can fight me and discover exactly what 3 years of genetic enhancement and 8 years of training can do to someone wearing heavy armor. For a moment, Cass considered fighting. His pride demanded it, his reputation required it, and his nature as a Vorth warrior made surrender almost unthinkable. Then he looked into Nora's brown eyes and saw something that made his decision for him. She wasn't angry, wasn't afraid, wasn't even particularly excited about the prospect of combat. She was simply confident, absolutely, completely certain that the outcome had already been decided. The plasma cannon fell from his nerveless fingers and clattered to the deck. I surrender, he said quietly. Nora nodded approvingly. Wise choice. Chief Grex, please secure the prisoners and coordinate with the TDC fleet for prisoner transfer. As the Vorth security chief emerged from his defensive position with his team, Nora walked back to her table and picked up her tablet. The battle was over, the pirates were captured, and order was restored to Hadley's Rest. Throughout the station, beings of a dozen different species watched the security feeds in stunned silence. They had witnessed something that would change their understanding of humanity forever. Later, as the last of the Crimson Swarm prisoners were transferred to TDC custody, a young Molari technician named Bloob approached Chief Grex with a question. that had been bothering him. "Chief," he said hesitantly, "if the humans are really that dangerous, why don't they conquer the galaxy? With capabilities like that, they could dominate every other species." Grex, who had spent the last few hours reviewing classified files that Nora had authorized him to access, looked thoughtfully at the small human woman who was once again reading her tablet in the corner of the hub. "Because, young Bloob," he said slowly, "the most dangerous predators are often the ones who choose not to hunt. They become dangerous precisely because they have something worth protecting." He gestured toward the station around them, where beings of different species were working together to repair the damage from the boarding action. "Humans could conquer us all," he continued, "but instead, they chose to protect us all, and that, I think, makes them more dangerous than any weapon we could imagine." Bloob thought about this for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Because when someone chooses to be your protector instead of your predator, you never want to give them a reason to change their mind." "Exactly," Grex said. "The humans don't carry weapons because they don't need to. They are the weapons, and they're pointed at anyone who threatens the peace they've chosen to protect." As the station returned to normal operations, word of the incident spread throughout the Outer Rim. The story grew in the telling, but the core truth remained the same. Humanity was not the weak, defenseless species that many had believed them to be. And in the vast darkness between the stars, other predators who had been eyeing human settlements with hungry eyes quietly found other hunting grounds. After all, there were easier prey than beings who smiled calmly when you threatened them and spoke of being weapons themselves. The galaxy was a dangerous place, but it was a little bit safer, knowing that somewhere among the stars, quiet humans sat reading tablets and waiting patiently for someone to make the mistake of threatening something they had chosen to protect.